All right, whilst people filter in, I think we can begin a little bit
Bueno,
because
mientras la
we have
gente
an
entra, podemos
amazing panel
empezar
of speakers
porque
who have
tenemos un
agreed to
panel
join us,
increíble de
and
invitadas e invitados
we're particularly
y que se juntaron a
excited and
nosotros.
interested to hear their
Estamos
different
particularmente
viewpoints because of the particular moment we're in. I'm sure many folks have seen what has happened in the last week with the UK arming themselves against Russia. There's a lot that is happening in, the flick of a dime right now. So I think it's extremely important that we share the views about what actually is happening in the world, what is important, what do peace activists need to think about at this moment, and how do we all kind of garner the energies, different energies we have across the world to advance the quest for peace and advance the quest for social prosperity in the face of a lot of irrational actors that are operating across the world. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Michaela Nondo Eerschroeg. I'm a member of No Cold War, which is a collective of different folks across the world who are interested in peace, in disarmament, in using the social resources we have towards development, not for war. So thank you very much for joining us right now in this event, post-elections, to think about what will be the role of the US, what will the Trump administration do in the forthcoming or foreseeable future? Will it differ? I think not, but we want to know what the particular tactics and specificities of the Trump foreign administration might be and what it might look like for the rest of the world in the coming years. So we have an amazing panel of esteemed guests who are going to join us today. We will begin with, we have 6 panelists who are joining us for the evening, and we will be giving interventions of around 8 minutes each. And then we will give a kind of reflection at the end for about 2 minutes. So if we have any kind of questions, unfortunately, we won't be able to necessarily answer all of them, but we are on Instagram and Twitter, and we have a website as well. So if there is any kind of discussion points, please feel free to submit them in the Zoom chat as well as on Twitter or Instagram, and I'm sure we can find ways in which we can discuss them in the future. But coming up first, we will have Walden Bello, who is an honorary research fellow in sociology at the State University of New York. He is a longtime peace activist from the Philippines and has been the vice president of or ran for vice presidency in Philippines. Sorry, he has ran for vice presidency in Philippines in 2022. He is also the founding member of Focus on the Global South. And of course, Philippines plays an important role and node in the US strategy in the Pacific. So we are really grateful to have you here, Walden. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michaela, and thank you to my fellow panelists. First of all, I didn't realize we just had 8 minutes, so I'll just have to radically cut down what I have to say. So let me begin. So let me just say is that looking at the first Trump vice presidency in 2017 to 2021, it is only in retrospect that we can appreciate how radically it was isolationist, anti-globalist, and protectionist. Trump, among other things, tore up the neoliberal Trans-Pacific Partnership that both the Democrats and Republicans championed, considered NATO commitments a burden and threatened to leave NATO, demanded that Japan and Korea pay more for keeping US troops and bases in their countries, trampled on the rules of the World Trade Organization, ignored the IMF and the World Bank, negotiated the US withdrawal from Afghanistan with the Taliban, and broke the West's united front against North Korea by stepping across the demilitarized zone to pat Kim Jong-un on the back on June 30, 2019. Some have said that his foreign policy was erratic or chaotic, But there was an underlying logic to his supposed madness, and this was his felt need to play opportunistically to an important part of his white working class and middle class base that felt that they'd had enough of bearing the burdens of empire for the sake of the American political and economic elites. So let me just continue by saying that what we had in contention last November 5th were two paradigms of empire. One is the old democratic, traditional Republican, liberal internationalist vision of empire that is expansive and seeks to make the world safe for American capital and American hegemony. And the opposing view, that of Trump and J.D. Vance, considers the empire overextended and proposes a quote-unquote aggressive defensive posture appropriate to a superpower in decline. The MAGA, or Make America Great Again approach, would focus on walling off the core of the empire, North America, from the outside world by radically restricting migration and trade, bringing prodigal American capital back, dispensing with what Trump considers the hypocritical exercise of extending foreign aid and exporting democracy, and abandon with a vengeance all efforts to address the accelerating global climate crisis. Rather than isolationism, perhaps a better term for Trump's grand strategy is, quote, selective engagement, to contrast it with the open-ended global engagement of liberal internationalism of Biden. One aspect of selective engagement will be disengagement from what Trump denigrates as quote-unquote shithole countries, meaning most of us, the global South, in terms of trying to shape our political and economic regimes via the IMF and the World Bank, and providing bilateral economic and military aid. Definitely, there will be no more talk of exporting freedom and democracy. That was staple of both Democratic and Republican administrations. Another aspect of selective engagement will be a spheres of influence approach. North America and South America will be regarded as being Washington's natural sphere of influence. So in my view, Trump will stick to the Monroe Doctrine, and maybe his choice of Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State might reflect this, since Rubio, a child of Cuban refugees, has been very hostile to left-leaning governments in Latin America. Cuba and Venezuela in particular will be squeezed more than they are right now. Eastern Europe will likely be seen as belonging to Moscow's sphere of influence, with Trump reversing the post-Cold War US policy of extending NATO eastward, which was a key factor that triggered Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The European Union will be left to fend for itself, with Trump unlikely to invest any effort to prop up NATO, much less expand its remit to the Asia-Pacific, as Biden has done. It would be a mistake to underestimate Trump's resentment of the Western allies of the United States, which in his view have prospered at the expense of America. The downgrading of the United States as a central player in the Middle East will continue, with Washington confining itself to providing weapons for Israel and encouraging a diplomatic rapprochement between Israel and the reactionary Arab states like Saudi Arabia to stabilize the area against Iran and the wave of radical Islamism that direct US intervention failed to contain. Needless to say, Trump will gladly turn a blind eye to Tel Aviv's carrying out its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians. Finally, in the Asia-Pacific, there is a strong likelihood that while Trump will pursue the trade and technology war with China that he initiated during his first term, he will dial down the military confrontation with Beijing, mindful that his base is not going to like military adventures that take away the focus from building Fortress America. Concretely, he'll raise the price for keeping US troops and bases in Japan and South Korea. He'll re-engage Kim Jong-un in the dialogue he was carrying out when he crossed the DMZ in 2019, a dialogue that could have unpredictable consequences for the US military presence in South Korea and Japan. Could a change in Washington's commitment of a military umbrella for South Korea and Japan be the price of a grand deal between Kim and Trump? This is the specter that haunts both states. Trump is likely to cease sending ships through the Taiwan Straits to provoke China, as Biden did. And one can expect him to tell Taiwan that there's a dollar price to be paid for being defended by the United States, and that Taipei should not expect the same assurance that Biden gave it, that Washington will come to Taiwan's rescue in the event of a Chinese invasion. I think Trump knows that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan was never in the cards anyway, and that Beijing's strategy was always cross-straits economic integration as the means to eventually absorb Taiwan. As for the Philippines and the South China Sea, a Trump administration is likely to tell Manila that there would be none of that ironclad so-called guarantee promised by Biden of an automatic US military response under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty in support of Manila in the event of a major confrontation with China in the South China Sea. Trump, it must be remembered, has gone on record saying that he would not waste one American life for what he has called, quote, rocks in the South China Sea. The Pentagon's push to push the Philippines as a forward base for the military confrontation with China that Biden fully supported is likely to be reviewed. In short, Trump is likely to acknowledge in practice that the Asia-Pacific is China's sphere of influence, though this message will be delivered informally and covered up by rhetoric of continued American engagement with the region. To summarize, there are few certainties when it comes to an unpredictable figure like Trump. These few certainties are that Trump will be bad for the climate, for American democracy, for women, and for minorities. As for the rest, one can speculate based on past behavior, statements, and events, but one would be wise to always remind oneself that while his instincts are isolationist, unpredictability in policy and action has been and will continue to be the hallmark of Donald Trump. But whatever happens, whether Trump's administration will be more bellicose or less bellicose than Biden's, we in the Global South must be prepared to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the continuing decline and crisis of the United States as a hegemonic power to accelerate that downspin and carve out more space for the pursuit of the interests of our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walden. Great start to the conversation, and particularly coming from a country in the Global South who is a heavily militarized US zone of influence in particular. So next we will have Jill Stein, who was the Green Party presidential candidate, is a Harvard-educated doctor, a pioneer in the environmental health advocacy domain, and has been organizing for the people, planet, and peace. She's seen also many victories in campaigns around finance reform, racial injustice, in terms of cleaning up of incinerators and the coal on the planet. And she was a principal organizer for the global climate convergence for people, planet, and peace over profit. So I know in your busy schedule, Jill, who just came out of the campaign, we are super appreciative to have you here. So over to you. Oh, you're muted.
Got it. Thank you so much, Michaela. And thank you especially to Walden Bello for those very thoughtful and compelling remarks. And thank you to all the speakers and everyone who's here. And just, coming off of a U.S. Presidential campaign, I'm mainly focused on the issues that were kind of front and center in the campaign that pertain more to trends in this country, which, for better and for worse, will have enormous impacts all over the world. And, I'm very interested to hear perspectives from outside of this country in this conversation, and really appreciate how critically important this dialogue is going forward. And, it feels very much like this is just a beginning, and it's a really critical beginning. And to frame sort of things from the biggest picture at this point, we are at a moment where the U.S. Continues to consider itself the monopolar power in the world, even while it is no longer in that position. So we do appear very much to be on a collision course between U.S. foreign policy, which is still one of so-called full spectrum dominance, that the U.S. will be the dominant player really across the world, and will not allow other regional powers even to rise to regional prominence. This is the foreign policy articulated with the fall of the Soviet Union around 1990, and it still continues to be the thinking of not only the presidential contenders, but also very much Congress. So we still have that to deal with. The U.S. is no longer the dominant power, but thinks that it is, and it's so critical that we stand up and force the hand of the U.S. To comply not only with reality, with shared power, with a multipolar world, but also to try to impress this upon Congress, that we see very much going along in all of these spheres of conflict right now. So that's just to kind of frame the larger dynamic here, which is that of an empire which is unraveling quickly and refuses to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge how much Trump is an unknown quantity, as Walden Bello pointed out. It's very unclear what direction he's going, and his appointments, in fact, the people who are now nominated to his cabinet are so not only that they represent some diversity, they are it's largely a cabinet of, by, and for the billionaires. There are at least 5 billionaires in extreme positions of power, including, for example, Elon Musk, who famously said in 2020, I believe it was 2022, may have been before that, who famously said that we will coup wherever we want to. This was in response to him being challenged for influencing U.S. policy to overthrow the government of Bolivia in order to improve his access to lithium and other rare metals. His response was, well, we will coup, wherever we want, get used to it. This is kind of the mindset of some of the players coming in into his cabinet, and his cabinet appointees are especially unqualified for their positions. Their main qualification seems to be opposing the function of the cabinet that they are joining. So it's very hard to say at this point how it's going to play out, and in fact whether all of them will in fact pass muster. It is a slightly encouraging sign that the Senate refused to simply rubber stamp with so-called recess appointments, which would have put these various players into power for 2 years without any scrutiny at all. And some of them, some of the more aggressive and bellicose among them may not pass scrutiny. And we already saw, for better or for worse, his nominee for Attorney General go down in flames. So I wouldn't rule out that will happen to others. So, I think what's very difficult to deal with right now in this transition is that we don't know what we're getting. And we don't know who will be whispering into Trump's ear. And because he does not have a fundamental a political ideology himself, he seems to be quite vulnerable to who's whispering to him. And let's see, just want to keep an eye on the time here. So let me just try to make a couple points. And please remind me, Michaela, when we're getting close, when we're within a minute or so of concluding.
3 minutes still. 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, thank you. So just, reminding people the events of this last week really are of great concern, where Biden gave the thumbs up for using long-range U.S. missiles to attack Russia. And we saw Russia basically, respond by lowering their threshold for using nuclear missiles. And threatening to use them. And they responded to the U.S. And UK use of long-range missiles by using a hypersonic long-range missile of its own. And what's terrifying to hear now is that the U.S. is also apparently has talked with Ukraine about arming Ukraine with nuclear weapons as well. And some of us, I think, are very riveted on this incredible crisis that we are in at this very moment. This crisis of potential nuclear escalation. And by the U.S. Allowing Ukraine to use these weapons, which means that there's direct involvement as well in the U.S. It's basically made the U.S. and NATO potential targets here as well. So this is extremely alarming. Also, the U.S. casting its fourth veto on a ceasefire resolution for Gaza makes clear that, again, well, this is still Biden, but Trump has given no indications that he will do otherwise. His offer of a ceasefire treaty with Lebanon and Hezbollah is, well, shall we say, it is not. It's not what it appears to be, and it's an extremely disabling arrangement that would basically be a surrender for Hezbollah. It's very unlikely to move forward, and it's really just the pretense of a resolution, which again, I think underscores that we have a very serious problem, which is not going away under Trump as we move into the new regime here. And just quickly, a couple things on a positive note, and that is that international solidarity, I think, has been critical in attempting to contain the U.S. and its genocidal war on Gaza. International solidarity has been very critical in supporting the decision of the ICJ, and also there are many countries now that have indicated they are going to comply with the International Criminal Court ruling, including the head of foreign policy for the EU, as well as Canada, Spain, Italy, several other countries as well. So we do see the international community lending support. Clearly, what we need on that front is an economic boycott, and over 52 countries have expressed solidarity in calling for, I should say, a military boycott. There probably ought to be an economic boycott as well, but at least the call is now out there for the military boycott. And I think it's just a hint of what we could potentially do in solidarity to ramp up the pressure, both to contain this the potential for nuclear war, which is very real right now, as well as to push back. The good news is that Israel cannot continue to. Well, this is mixed news. Israel cannot continue this war by itself. It is desperate for boots on the ground right now, unable to conscript them from their own people. Biden has promised boots on the ground. The U.S. has already provided some, and the draft has been reestablished here, the military draft. So there is definitely the potential for a lot of pushback here from the U.S. As the open-ended commitment to this genocidal war continues to come home. There's a lot more to be said, but I will yield, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I look forward to hearing what all the other discussants have to say. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Jill. Highly appreciated. And in particular, because as you mentioned, there's several talking points that I'm having sparks in my brain right now. One of them is that we just released a briefing with Tricontinental called Trump's Victory is a Moribund Symptom of US Imperial Decline. And I think that this is particularly a point that we're trying to share from Tricontinental, from No Cold War, that these reactions are based on the fact that the US is in decline and is acting as a wounded animal would do, which is viciously. But the question of how the international community responds to this and how we put pressure is, I think, an important source of discussion and point of reflection. But I will say, I was just in Niger where we had a international gathering of people in solidarity and organizations in solidarity with the people of the Sahel. And one of the encouraging things was that earlier this year, they broke their agreement with the US military, which Niger had the largest foreign US military base, a big drone base that was overseeing basically the entire Sahel. And they broke their relation or the 10-year agreement earlier this year. And we still need to kick out the diplomatic forces, but the US drone base is no longer in use. So there are steps being made across the world that I think are optimistic. So I'm going to go on to our next speaker, Claudia de la Cruz, who was a presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. She is an activist and educator and former co-executive director of the People's Forum, which was an important cultural and political space in New York City. She's been involved for many, many years in peace activism. So I'm super excited to have you here. Claudia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Micaela. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on what side of the world you are in. And I want to start just by saying that we are definitely in a historic and decisive moment for humanity and the planet. And obviously examples like those in Africa, I'm glad you mentioned the conference you went to, Micaela, are projections of where our people are in terms of defense and resistance. And that's hopeful. Every and any time our people are fighting imperialism anywhere in the world is a hopeful time. And so we know that obviously our conversation is about global conflict and what the Trump administration brings. And we are clear that Trump is a product of capitalism and US imperialism. And while we understand that Trump is a change in the management of the US empire and it brings its particularities, we do not underestimate the extreme right and billionaire agenda that he is there to advance. We cannot predict, as comrades have mentioned, what Trump will do, but based on his first term and the way in which he's organizing his administration, there is no doubt that Trump will intensify US imperialist offensive internationally and will continue to attack the working class and the most historically marginalized communities in the United States. We cannot isolate Trump from the brutal insistence of the US ruling class to dominate the world. And that is the US imperialist project that is for them at stake and is for us to defeat. We need to understand Trump in the context of the ruling class, the capitalists, US imperialism. And, you know, in this particular moment in history, I think Gaza has revealed a lot of things, and it's revealed precisely just how the political class in this country is utilized by billionaires and by warmongers. At all levels of the economic and political power, they have professed their support to continue the extermination of the Palestinian people and the expansion of war in the Middle East. Over $26 billion in 15 months. And this is all despite the majority of the population in the United States and the majority of people around the world demanding a ceasefire, demanding an arms embargo to Israel. Another example of how the ruling class is obviously very much aligned in warmongering and expanding war is their approach to China. We have to remember that when President Obama announced the pivot to Asia, it was a little bit unclear what he meant the policy was slightly ambiguous, but under Trump, it became crystal clear. In 2018, the US adopted a new military doctrine announcing to the world that its priority was major power conflict. And what this meant was prioritizing an expansion of war on the People's Republic of China as the centerpiece of its new military doctrine. So when Biden came into office, rather than repudiating and going against this doctrine, what he did was embrace this new doctrine. And again, this is the project that upholds the politics that sustains the ruling class and its imperialist agenda. So this shows that war or confrontation with China is not simply a Trump policy. It's something that is going to continue as a position that is agreed upon within and among all factions of the ruling class. And this is what possesses such a grave danger, that the US ruling class has chosen this insane policy in consensus, without any debate anywhere in the political halls of power. It's been consensus of it. If you defy it, if you debate it, then you're an agent of China. If you disagree with it, you're an agent of China. And in his second term, what we can expect is a new round of tariffs, sanctions, and restrictions towards Chinese companies. This is something he's been promising. He was promising it throughout his whole campaign. I think it's important to talk a little bit about Latin America, for example, and the Caribbean. Trump intensified the US imperialist offensive during his first term. He utilized sanctions as warfare against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, while US-backed opposition groups grew and were emboldened. And many of them were violent. So those arms, those weapons, that funding came from the United States. In Bolivia, he supported a coup against Evo Morales. In Cuba, he rolled back advancements on the normalization of relationships between US and Cuba and enforced over 240 sanctions that have significantly crippled the Cuban economy. And that's on top of the 60+ year blockade that the United States has, illegally and unjustly held on Cuba. That he reinstated Cuba into the state of sponsor of terrorism list, which blocks Cuba from acquiring needed essential goods. Haiti, which has suffered tremendously for their bravery in becoming an independent, the first Black independent nation in this continent, will continue to suffer under a Trump presidency. I mean, Trump supported the US-backed corrupt government of Jovenel Moise. So a second term is likely to escalate US imperialist interventions across Latin America, is going to embolden far-right movements and governments like Milei in Argentina, like Bukele in El Salvador. It will worsen the economic and social instability in the region. It will tighten sanctions. I mean, Talmadge mentioned that Walden and Jill as well. And I think it's important to understand that they will move to push the neoliberal project to undermine the regional efforts of integration that already exist, such as CELAC, ALBA TCP, which all have been contributions from mostly the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela to challenge US hegemony. I think inclusions of characters like Marco Rubio, who is obsessed. He is obsessed with dismantling leftist and socialist governments from China to Venezuela. Marco Rubio has called for sanctions, supports of military intervention, aggressive actions against Venezuela and Cuba. Rubio's appointment should alert us to what Trump plans to do in the continent and in the world. Trump's return to office is going to deepen the contradictions of US imperialism, deepening the exploitation of workers globally and in the United States. Trump's rhetoric around America first and enemy nations fuels xenophobia, which distracts from the shared struggles of workers at home and abroad. While US imperialism forces migration precisely through sanctions, blockades, political intervention, and the acceleration of climate crisis, Trump, Republicans, and Democrats alike blame and use immigrants as scapegoats for their economic and the social issues of the working class in the United States. And their deficiencies are obviously put aside. They don't talk about what creates this migration flow into the United States. It just justifies the strengthening of the militarization in the border, investing in criminalization and surveillance and persecution and the detention of millions of immigrants. So Trump is promising to heighten those attacks on immigrant communities, and that will lead to the intensifying attacks against immigrants in the workplace. They will be forced to work for lower paying jobs, going into more invisibility and unable to access any benefits. This only benefits the corporations. We can expect that he will increase the precarity for all workers. And so we know that in his first term, he rolled back regulations that and further eroded the ability of workers to organize, to fight for better working conditions, things that, again, only benefit the multi-corporations and the billionaires. Trump's first term increasingly pumped money into the military-industrial complex, $700 billion. We're at trillions now. So we can expect that he will continue to do that, pump more money into the military-industrial complex at the expense of working-class people in this country, cutting public services, divesting from public health services, cutting programs like Medicaid or housing assistance, education. We see with the appointments that he's putting in place that there will be a further privatization of healthcare and education. And so we could expect many things. I think the response is what matters. And we must use this moment, as Comrade Walden was mentioning, the challenges and the opportunities to insist that the only antidote to US imperialism is building and strengthening working class solidarity and working class internationalism. We need to reject the framing that China, Venezuela, Palestine, Cuba, or any other nation state is an enemy. We need to highlight the struggles between the US working class and those working class people in other nations. And we need to oppose the US war machine and militarism. We need to continue to reveal the monstrosity of this war economy and fight to reduce military spending and redirect those funds towards social programs and climate action. And I think that we're a prime moment to do that, because the mask has definitely come off and a lot of people are able to understand the connections between their own struggles and the struggles of people in the working class community internationally. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you. I'm so glad we have you and Jill who are there and have been, I can't even imagine the energy expelled in the process of trying to not only enter into the political arena, but to conscientize and make sure that people understand what the machinery is behind the elite in the US right now. And for those who don't know, who want to get a little bit more information, Tricontinental has a document called Hyperimperialism, where we have a lot of information about what, like Claudia specifically mentioned, about what the political elite in the US have been establishing, what the role of the US military is, which, by the way, the US military, with its accomplices that it subordinates, spends almost 75% of global military spending. It's a huge amount, and it's not the amount that the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research documents annually, which is around 800 billion, but it's double that. It's like a huge amount. But next we will have, and thank you so much, Claudia, amazing. Next we will have Sevim, and we're gonna shift the geography a little bit, where, apologies, my internet is lagging. There we go. Sevim has been a member of the Bundestag for many years, since 2005, apologies. And sorry, my internet is lagging. Oh, sorry. So she is a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. She's a spokesperson for the Party of Reason and Justice in the German Bundestag. She's been an active voice for peace and has recently published a book on NATO and the role of NATO in the world and in European policy making. So over to you, Sevim.
Thank you, Michaela. Can you hear me? Thanks for the previous speakers. Just to introduce myself, I'm a member of the German Parliament since 2005. I'm a member of a new party. We just built a new party. It's called Sahra Wagenknecht Alliance Party for Reason and Justice. Just built this party. They had the party congress in January, and we had 4 elections till then, have been very successful, the European parliamentary elections, and 3 state elections in the eastern part of Germany, where we focused very much on the stationing of the weapons from the US on German soil 2026, where we said this is the condition for us not to govern. We are mobilizing for the general elections, the snap elections now on the 23rd of February, where we stick into these policies against NATO war policies, the economic war and the proxy wars. So before talking about what Trump means for the global conflict, we must consider what the lame duck US President Joe Biden is currently doing. And the outgoing Biden administration is risking nothing less than a third world war in Ukraine on European soil, where I am. And we are in a situation that is far more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And when I now hear that NATO is counting on Russia not making good on its threat of a counterstrike, and that Russian President Putin said to be merely bluffing, that is precisely the mentality of those sleepwalking into a major war. Well, because what will happen if next time British arms factories are struck by Russian missiles? Will they then risk a nuclear war that would mean the end of Europe? Especially remarkable here is the denial of reality among NATO politicians and military leaders in Europe. We can see war approaching in slow motion, as when, for example, the genius German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock proclaims that the aim of the war is to ruin Russia, or the British generals declare that the British army is ready to take on Russia. So historically, this is all too reminiscent of the Wilhelmine overconfidence and the grotesque underestimation of its opponents, in this regard Russia, which paved the way for the First World War here in Europe. So now to Trump. I think we are witnessing a declining hegemon, like Claudia said, that currently seems to be betting an absolute escalation in the proxy war in Ukraine in order to stave off what it perceives as impending defeat. And if we look at how the defeated US President Joe Biden has drastically increased the risk of world war by authorizing US long-range weapons for President Zelensky's attacks on Russia, on Russian territory, one must hope that Donald Trump keeps his promise to quickly end the Ukraine war and thus avert this all-out escalation towards which Washington is heading at the moment. So Biden and NATO are now conjuring up a crisis that goes far beyond the dangers of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if Russia follows through on its threat to retaliate with intermediate range missiles, we will then be in a major war in Europe. But Trump also poses dangerous uncertainties. Trump's team is, like Claudia said, diverse. It includes neoconservatives, such as Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio, for example, like Claudia mentioned, and who in the 2016 election was still calling Trump a third world dictator and criticizing him for his proposed Russia policy. So the scenario in the central positions is more likely to be Trump could be the man who helps to end or at least freeze wars like the one in Ukraine, but only to pursue and all the more aggressive strategy of US confrontation and containment vis-à-vis China, Latin America, and the Middle East. Russia, meanwhile, would be left to the European NATO allies to take care of in order to free up the resources for the US on the three fronts described, like China, Latin America, and Middle East, and with China as the main enemy of the US. And there is much to suggest that Biden only wants to postpone NATO's catastrophic defeat in Ukraine until Trump is president and in office. Hence, this unprecedented escalation in the interim period. I mean, I have never seen such a thing like Biden did now. So Trump could seek to avoid open NATO-Russia war and to contain the war in Ukraine along the existing front lines. And as I said, the goal would be to divert US resources against China. And they already started. I mean, Germany is the second biggest arms supplier for Ukraine after the US, and second biggest financial supplier after the US. So Ukraine's NATO membership would be suspended for a decade or two, but it should be remembered that it was Trump who pushed for the arms buildup in Kiev in 2017 and who pursued a strategy of leading Ukraine along as an informal member of the NATO. So regarding the Middle East, the Trump administration will be 150% on the side of the Netanyahu government, parts of which are far right, extreme far right. And even though the Israeli prime minister is now subject to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, our German government just declared that they are still thinking how to deal with the arrest warrant. Me, myself, I am very ready to arrest him when he is on German soil. However, it cannot be ruled out that the war in Gaza and Lebanon will be waged even more aggressively by the US as a proxy war in which Trump could nevertheless seek to emphasize the benefits for the US and push for a temporary ceasefire. And as far as Latin America is concerned, the most aggressive US policy since 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion is to be anticipated. The Trump administration will attempt to stage a complete rollback in Latin America in line with the Monroe Doctrine, with the aim of regime change in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, but also in Brazil, and Bolivia is also in the crosshairs. So, however, it is to be expected that the ultimate escalation is being prepared with regard to China. And a US economic war against China has already been set in motion with both moral and economic arguments put forward. The European Union is already acting as Washington's aid agency. The leader of the European Commission, von der Leyen, is a talking doll of the US. And in any case, it's not taking any independent action. So don't rely on the Europeans. And German industry will be sunk in this situation for sure. Germany and Europe are now threatened with deindustrialization. And as a result, the erosion of what remains of the welfare state. China will remain the main adversary of the US administration. Trump will launch a trade war right from the start, he said. He already announced it. He's already announced that he's planning 40% of increase in import tariffs regarding China, 20% import tariffs to the Europeans, especially to the Germans. This will have serious consequences for the global economy. So we will, at that point, be looking at the end of globalization. So the negative consequences of the German economy and the welfare state here are incalculable. And the same applies to Europe as a whole. So not a good perspective at all. At the end, the only good perspective is, or the only hope is, that that actually Trump with his slogan "Make America Great Again" or America First, it is likely that he's going to be the president who is going to do the global South great, and he's facing the decline of the US, and he's going to be the president of the decline of the West. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sevim. Super important and super grateful that we have you here on this panel, particularly because, as you said, the subordination of European interests to the US is particularly important in this moment. So I'm going to hand over to the next speaker, who is Bianca Mugyenyi, who is the co-founder and former director of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and the former co-executive director and co-founder of climate justice organization, The Leap. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michaela. Thank you to No Cold War for organizing this, this very important, timely discussion. I am here representing Canada China Focus and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And it's been such a pleasure to be here and to feel like there are such adults in the room and to hear such powerful, inspiring, visionary panelists, you know? And so I've enjoyed your terrific presentations, but the analysis is sobering. I'm going to give a Canadian spin on all of this, a north of the border spin. And I'll begin like others have in saying that it's not easy to predict exactly how Trump's election will shape our foreign and military policy. But you know, we all know, however, that there tends to be more continuity than change in US and Canadian foreign policy. For our part, Canada's foreign policy is overwhelmingly driven by support for corporate interests, like our massive mining sector, and support for empire, historically British and now American. And while it's early days still, we can certainly draw lessons from the shifts that we saw during Trump's first presidency. So I'm going to take a similar tack to some of the other presenters. So back in 2017, when Trump took office, Justin Trudeau responded by appointing Chrystia Freeland as foreign minister. And this didn't go unnoticed. The US Embassy in Ottawa even declared, quote unquote, Canada adopts America First foreign policy. So this was a really quick recalibration to align with Trump's agenda. And nowhere was Canada's America First foreign policy more clear than its actions against Venezuela. So under Chrystia Freeland's leadership, Ottawa led efforts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. They set up the Lima Group. In 2017, they brought Venezuela to the ICC, coordinated support for little-known politician Juan Guaido as president. You know, people have been talking about Marco Rubio here. We know that he was an architect of Trump's brutal maximum pressure on Venezuela policies. And he's now Trump's pick for Secretary of State. So, you know, there's that. And in Canada, Chrystia Freeland has been appointed to lead a revived special US Relations Cabinet Committee to manage relations with Trump. So not great. Trump's return, and again, you know, some of this is just repeating what others have said, but trying to give it the Canadian spin, is that, you know, there will likely be increased tensions with China, as has been mentioned. In his first term, this was translated into economic warfare and the weaponization of trade. Canada was pressurized to follow suit. Most notably, I don't know if people follow the 2018 arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. And more recently in Canada, we're seeing just like extreme rhetoric and hyped protectionist policies. And a couple of months ago, the Canadian government imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. And after this happened, our major paper of record, the Globe and Mail, noted that Ottawa's use of unilateral tools to implement 100% tariffs on EVs is a hallmark of a trade war. Additionally, our Canada's 2-year-old Indo-Pacific strategy, renamed, further oriented Canada towards aligning our military with the US containment policy. And this strategy has committed Canada to further militarizing its approach to China, including things like sending more vessels to the Taiwan Strait and south of China, South China Sea. And, this is a place where military tensions are already seriously threatening global peace. In Israel, Trump's administration was clearly a gift to Benjamin Netanyahu. His uncritical support emboldened further dispossession, violence against Palestinians, and now with Trump back in power, we see the possibility of US war with Iran. Canada, meanwhile, has enabled Israel's genocide and warfare in the region through shielding it from accountability and arming its military through multi-million-dollar deals. I was really pleased to hear folks talking about Haiti on today's call. Turning to Haiti, Trump may be overtly racist, and he is. They're eating the pets and shithole countries remarks are burned into memory. But Biden's policies and Trudeau's policies are actually no less harmful and no less racist. Maybe with a bit of a mask on, but Canada plays a central role in the so-called core group of foreign ambassadors, which wield immense influence and control and power over Haiti's affairs, sidelining Haitian sovereignty. And under Trump, I think we can expect the US to continue its exploitative policies in Haiti. Regarding Ukraine, we've heard some pretty strong really strong, sobering analysis on today's call. We're at a really critical and frightening point in history. Canada is particularly hawkish on Ukraine, and clearly fears Trump deprioritizing the conflict. They've provided billions in arms, $10 billion in other assistance to Ukraine. They supported the 2014 coup against Yanukovych. They backed NATO's eastward expansion. They've no doubt escalated tensions. Moving on to NATO, the summit was recently here in the city that I live, Montreal. And at that summit, the Liberals committed to doubling military spending to meet NATO's 2% GDP target by 2032, an additional $41 billion annually, which doubles the current spending. And Ukraine has been the rationale for this spending, but militarists are now using Trump. They're using Trump as an excuse and saying we have to follow Trump or we're going to face the consequences. So that's the new argument. Just the day before yesterday, Republican Congressman Mike Turner actually scolded Canada in Politico for not putting enough resources into war, effectively demanding that our social needs be sacrificed for NATO's conflicts. Look, in terms of militarism, the Canadian military and its spending really serves the US empire in two major ways. They're essentially an extension of the US military, and also our arms industry is dominated by US giants like Lockheed, like General Dynamics, which profit massively from war while just pouring Canadian resources into American corporations. So, I'm just gonna conclude by talking about the fact that with a world on fire, with overlapping multiple crises, with people struggling so much on so many fronts, it is reckless, it is outrageous to hand billions and billions more over to the war machine. And I just want to invite our audience to imagine redirecting these resources to clean energy development, to global climate action, to the terrible housing crisis that we're seeing, new housing, poverty reduction, to high-speed rail, the arts, healthcare, clean water and reserves. You name it. And instead, Canada and the US choose to escalate conflict and undermine the very international solidarity that we need so desperately to both face and overcome today's crisis. So, I really want to echo what Claudia said about, we need internationalism, we need solidarity, and we need to remember that these endless wars, these skyrocketing military budgets are not inevitable. They're not inevitable. And the stakes are so high. We need a new vision, and that's what the folks here on this call are bringing. Our movements need to rise to the occasion and demand what we have been talking about here today: foreign policies rooted in solidarity, in internationalism, diplomacy, peace, justice, and care for the earth. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bianca. Honestly, fabulous, amazing, particularly because, as you already said and shared, that there are countries like Canada who don't see themselves as part of the core of this kind of international onslaught against the global South. And it's important to know that there are people like you who are fighting against it. So I'm gonna give it over to Charles, who is a writer and organizer for the Qiao Collective, a group of dedicated people who are trying to bring critical perspectives around US-China relations, and you raised China yourself. And so, Charles, I hope you can share a little bit about what this means in terms of the bigger global perspective and how China, Russia, others are the target of the US empire in this moment when we do need peace. We need to invest, as Bianca said, in social services, and the disproportionate amount of investment in war won't serve us, won't serve anyone. Over to you, Charles.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mika, and thank you to all my fellow panelists for your fantastic contributions. I'm actually speaking here today, I would say, firstly, as a member of the No Cold War Coordinating Committee, where I have the distinct misfortune of being the only US national actually based in the United States. And that fact is in many ways a testament to the international reach of No Cold War, but it does raise the question, given the global scope of our work, why did we publish a whole briefing and organize a whole event, namely this one, solely dedicated to one country's national election, in a year that has been dubbed the biggest election year in history, with over half the world's population going to the polls? The answer should be clear. This one country alone is responsible for 53% of actual military expenditures worldwide, together with its allies, 75%. And it runs a globe-spanning empire of over 900 overseas military bases. And through this mechanism, it exercises effectively dictatorial one-party rule, masquerading as two-party rule with typical American extravagance, as Julius Nyerere quipped, over the 96% of the world population, which lacks even the illusion of a democratic choice in the matter by virtue of not being US citizens. That leaves about 4% who are US citizens, 3% who are eligible to vote for president of the United States, 2% or so who actually do vote, and in reality, as few as 0.03% of that 2%, whose votes actually matter in the outcome, thanks to our horrendously antiquated electoral college system. Now, for non-US listeners who might not be familiar with all the gory details of how this works, it's a system where each state in the United States is assigned a certain number of electoral votes and allocates all of them to whichever presidential candidate wins the most popular votes in that state. And it's the outcome of the electoral vote that matters, not the popular vote. So you might ask why this system treats individual states as unitary blocks and not the country as a whole when it is an election for president of the United States. There's a number of sordid historical reasons for this that date back to the founding of the United States, and this is actually pretty important to highlight. Number one is that at the time of founding, each state could basically restrict voting rights arbitrarily based on race, gender, property ownership, and this kind of differentiation rendered the idea of a national popular vote meaningless. Number two is that new states could only be added to the US once white settlers had killed or expelled enough indigenous people to secure an overwhelming democratic majority in that territory. Number three is that until the Civil War, new states were only added to the country if their addition could guarantee the survival and expansion of the institution of slavery. So this is all to say that the continued survival of, this monstrosity, the Electoral College, is in many ways a constant reminder that the United States was and still is a genocidal settler colony whose continental and then global expansion made it the core of the hyper-imperialist world system and the primary sponsor, of course, of today's settler colonial Zionist genocide in Gaza and Lebanon. And for that reason, I find it tremendously ironic that this same Electoral College in the recent 2024 election, by narrowing the national presidential contest to a handful of so-called swing states where the outcome was in doubt, in other words, a tiny minority of a tiny minority of a tiny minority of the world population, somehow put the spotlight on the one place in this country in which the global anti-genocide majority could speak most legibly. And I'm speaking here of the state of Michigan, which is home to the highest proportion of Arab Americans in the country, and to its first Arab majority city, Dearborn, which resoundingly punished the Democrats for their hand in this genocide by slashing their 2020 vote total in half and giving 18% of their votes to Jill Stein. Nationally, the figures among Muslim voters are even more stark. And here I'm going to quickly share this chart that I pulled up last night based on exit polling from the Council on American Islamic Relations. This shows the party preference of Muslim voters in different elections from 2000 to 2024. And as you can see, from 2020 to 2024, we had the largest swing of any since, basically the swing from 2000 to 2004 against George Bush because of the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. And indeed, this was a swing to the Green Party, right? 53% for Jill Stein, and then only 21% for Trump, and a stunning 20% for Kamala Harris. So probably the largest swing ever to a third party from the two main parties among any demographic ever in US history. And I would say that within the confines of the US electoral system, this historic repudiation of this genocidal imperialist duopoly is the closest that any voting bloc could get to aligning with the overwhelming global majority, a majority that has manifested in repeated 14-1 votes at the UN Security Council demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, and 124-14 vote at the General Assembly demanding an end to the Israeli occupation, and in the millions upon millions of ordinary people who have resisted by occupying their campuses, blockading circulation, sabotaging weapons facilities, or indeed on the ground engaging in armed struggle. And this point brings me to the other capacity in which I'm speaking, which, as Mika mentioned, is as a member of Qiao Collective, which brings together anti-imperialists in the Chinese diaspora, predominantly in the US and Canada, in order to challenge US-led aggression against China. And here our analysis, which we share with No Cold War at large, is that the United States has escalated its drive to war against China without interruption between the Trump and Biden presidencies, and will continue to do so into Trump's second term. And moreover, that this new Cold War on China is inseparable from the global machinations of US imperialism, which envisions both Israel and Taiwan explicitly as so-called unsinkable aircraft carriers at opposite ends of Asia. Indeed, the bipartisan congressional majority in favor of arms sales to Taiwan was even larger than the majority for arms sales to Israel in this past April's votes on the National Security Supplemental Package. And likewise, when it comes to domestic repression of anti-imperialist forces, we see that the accusations of anti-Semitism and material support for terrorism lodged against the Palestine Solidarity Movement are merging more and more seamlessly with those of allegiance to as they put it, communist China. Indeed, these accusations often issue from the same regime mouthpieces, most notably incoming Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and are directed at the same targets. As such, we at Qiao Collective have a clear message for our own diaspora community, which is that we must realize, as so many of our Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim compatriots have, that we are not a small embattled minority in this country to be scapegoated for its pathologies. Let them question our so-called loyalty to the empire, because we owe it no loyalty. Our only loyalty is to humanity and to our respective homelands' ongoing struggles for sovereignty, self-determination, and liberation from imperialism. And far from a minority, at a global level, we belong to that overwhelming majority that once went by the name of third world peoples, and which today proudly wears the label bestowed upon it by the Palestinian resistance, the free people of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, all the panelists. Incredible interventions, and thank you for taking the time to share the interventions with us all. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'm hoping that we can get 1 to 2 minute reflections from everyone who has already given their intervention. And particularly around the question of, if I may, China, because I think that there's a big conversation around where are we directing our energies and what is it that we want to achieve as peace activists, particularly now when there's so much noise around who's the enemy of progress versus who are the people who are trying to establish progress. So I'll give it over to Jill. I think, yeah, Jill. Oh, unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. So thanks again to all of our speakers for this very provocative conversation. I feel like we could expand all day on the remarks of each one of us. On the question of China, I just want to note that Trump's two of his policies, in fact, one, and so this goes beyond China as well, but in particular the tariffs that Trump intends to impose on China, that he's campaigned on, are going to be devastating to the American economy and will greatly intensify inflation. So he's really planting the seeds of his own dysfunction and eventual demise, I think. He's going to very much undermine his political support and the condition of American workers, which is already extremely precarious, with something like 65% of all Americans living paycheck to paycheck, half of Americans really struggling to keep a roof over its head. And we know that so many people who voted for Trump were not really voting for him. They were really just voting against the neoliberal policies of the Democrats, and are particularly in very deep struggle financially. So he's going to really undermine the kind of the consensus that he needs in order to move his policies forward. So I think we will see enormous resistance here in this country, not only because inflation will get much worse, but also his policies on immigration. That too, if he proceeds with mass deportations, not only will that be extremely expensive, it's supposed to be basically $100 billion a year, something like that. But it will also be another massive disruption to the economy, and will also contribute to inflation here. So I think we can expect there to be enormous resistance to Trump's policies across the board. So that to me is hopeful, and just confirms that there's a lot of room for collaboration, for resistance. There's a rally taking place on the 20th on Inauguration Day, a fight back rally, which is going to help launch kind of a greater voice for political resistance. And just briefly speaking to what Charles pointed out with the Arab American and the Muslim American community, there are many, many voters, I think, in this country who are on the verge of flipping to a progressive, independent, socialist, internationalist point of view. And that's definitely something I think that's really important for us to support in this country because, for better or worse, the political dynamics in this country are going to reverberate enormously around the world. But the more solidarity we can have, I think, the more we can leverage this major transition in global dynamics that's taking place right now as the empire basically, winds down in its final days to make the transition as quickly and peacefully as we can to the multipolar world that we actually are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Claudia?
Well, since these are my last 2 minutes, I want to thank the No Cold War folks for convening this space. And I think that we need more spaces like this, not only at the international level, but also at the regional level and at the national level in our different nation states. So I want to thank you all for convening it. I think, the question for the international working class is now, will we destroy US imperialism or will we allow US imperialism to end humanity and the planet? That's where we are at this particular crucial moment in history. Our estimation is that we are entering a new stage of struggle, as I mentioned before, a decisive and historic moment where we are witnessing an empire in decline, like has been mentioned before, a deepening of contradictions, where there is overwhelming wealth and more war and more poverty, historic advances in technology, and at the same time, more deaths caused by preventable diseases and the acceleration of a climate catastrophe. And so we are to be part of the organizing efforts at the most grassroots and local levels, to the most national, to the most international. We have our work cut out for us. And dismantling the lies, the many lies that we have been taught. China is definitely not our enemy. Neither are the people in Russia. Neither are the people in Venezuela. Neither are the people in Cuba. We have one enemy, and that's US imperialism. And I think we need to be insisting on that with our people. I think that historically, in the United States, we have a responsibility to fight US imperialism from the belly of the beast. So this is for my US people, that we need to start making connections between our struggles here as working class people. We know that the tariffs on China, the tariffs on any other country, trade wars affect working class people all across this country, all across the globe. And so we have to be able to cut through the lies, cut through the narratives that ultimately are there to sustain and promote and advance imperialism, that are there to make those who are billionaires more wealthy, while we, the majority of people in the world, become poorer. And so I think as an organizer, speaking as an organizer now, our task is to be able to make those connections. It's to be able to go to very old methods of organizing, making every space in our communities political, from the corner stores to the salons, to the barber shops, to the dining table, because these are things that are of high stakes for humanity. And I think what we are experiencing globally is the overwhelming resistance of the global majority. And we, as people in the United States, need to be part of that global majority and allow ourselves to be moved and to take the actions necessary, not only to strike the belly of the beast, but to destroy the belly of the beast, destroy US imperialism, and actually build a resistance that will allow other people to breathe across the globe. And so I just wanted to share that. I think anyone and everyone who has a commitment to peace, that has a commitment to justice, that is concerned about people and the planet, has a responsibility, regardless of wherever we are in our political journey, whether we know much or know little. we all have something to contribute. And so I'm grateful for this space. I hope we continue to create spaces like this, and at the same time, bring these discussions to our local communities, to our families, to our friends, to our coworkers, and do the organizing work that is necessary. And those who are in the United States could join the National Day of Action that Jill mentioned, that some of our comrades are convening. It's January 20th. We're going to be all across this country, not only protesting, but creating coalition with organizations all across this country, not only to survive the 4 years, but to stand stronger after these 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And everyone in our family should go out on the 20th of January against the new Trump administration. But next is Sevim, Bianca, and Charles.
Yeah, I mean, very short. The last days I was touring with my book here in Germany, and because of the decision of the US President Joe Biden with the long-range missiles, people are fearing really big danger in Germany and in Europe. They fear a very serious war on European soil. So we do face a multipolar world in the making, but in the same time, of course, we do face the US imperialism, which is in a decline and is trying with the NATO, which is a US club, of course, is leading the world to the brink of a world war like never before. And that's why I am very thankful for this exchange here, for this international discussion, because I think we need very much international networking and international mobilization against the threat of world war, against the proxy wars, against the economic wars, for social justice instead of imperial war policies. And therefore, we need really broad alliances, broad coalitions, not just the typical leftist, left-wing, just the trade unions and so on. I think in facing a really big risk of a World War III, we need broad alliances, broad coalitions, everyone who's helping to stop this war and to stop the war policies like your organization, No Cold War. We need all these alliances. So therefore, thanks a lot for this exchange.
Thank you. Bianca, Charles, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody. I'm also going to try and use this last few minutes to just say thank you to the organizers and to the other speakers. And just for your powerful vision and your leadership. It's really such an honor to be here. I'm enlivened. Like, where is the demo? Let's go. And to Michaela too, for your beautiful facilitation. Thank you so much for bringing us together. So, I mean, in terms of China specifically, I mean, it's in this world that we're living in with like this, the economic instability, the pandemics, the climate disasters, and on and on and on. And the specter of nuclear war, which, you know, thank you for bringing that up, and it should continue to be brought up. We just can't afford Cold War thinking. We can't afford it. It's not just bad policy. It's a complete betrayal of our future. The US would not survive war with China. China would not survive war with the US, and humanity would not survive a war between the US and China. So let's act like it. It's not an option. So let's act like it. And, you know, when it comes to China, I think it was Noam Chomsky that said, work together or perish together, right? Work together or perish together. And I really took those words to heart. And so what I'm excited about is to carry forth the energy from this discussion, to carry it forward, and to just know that our movements have a pivotal role to play. And so I just want to encourage the audience and people who watch this later on to find ways to become part of the anti-war movement, peace movement. It wants you, you know, if you're not already engaged, and really on any level, and to know that protest works, activism works. We do need more of it. And we need to make the empire uncomfortable. We need to make these corporations uncomfortable. And we need to do the opposite for ourselves. We need to give ourselves an enticing, resonant, internationalist vision, right? That we can enjoy, that we can get excited about, where peace and diplomacy and solidarity really replace, these endless wars and this exploitation. Like, who doesn't want that? So let's reject the militarized logic of the new Cold War. It's very important to make connections across social movements to create a really united front against these genocidal wars, imperialism, militarism, and internationalism is the future, right? So long live the resistance. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you again to all my fellow panelists, to Mika for facilitating, to the team that made this possible. I guess in my original contribution, I didn't get too much in the weeds of the geopolitical reality, so I'm glad my fellow panelists did. But one point that I want to return to in regards to the incoming Trump regime is that insofar as some of its personnel indicate a break with at least elements of the neoconservative foreign policy consensus, what they aim to do essentially is to pursue a sort of divide and conquer strategy within Eurasia, principally this really fanciful project of somehow realigning Russia with the interests of the United States and pitting it against China. And what they imagine essentially is a reverse of what they accomplished during the Cold War in terms of a selective rapprochement with China against the USSR, where they took advantage of the fact that the counter-hegemonic, the anti-imperialist bloc during the Cold War was so riven with internal divisions, with essentially deep doctrinal and sort of sectarian contradictions that the imperialists were able to take full advantage of. And what we see today is that strategy is not working, because having seen the kind of devastation that the U.S.-led unipolar world order has wrought on the peoples of the global South in particular, but not limited to that, right? The entire former Soviet and Eastern Bloc as well. These countries that have emerged today as the standard bearers of a product of sovereignty and of self-determination, right? China, Russia, and Iran being the strongest within the Eurasian continent, as well as all the sovereign projects of regional integration in Latin America and the incipient ones that we're seeing in Africa, led by the Association of Sahel States. They recognize a very strong common interest, that brings them together across all of the different systems, the different ideologies that spans that broad collection of forces of resistance. And in many ways, I think they model for those of us in the anti-war movements here in the imperial core a kind of pluralism and a kind of acknowledgement of both difference and of shared interests that we should carry forward as well, in terms of rejecting sectarianism and holding fast to a resolute defense of sovereignty and self-determination, regardless of what we may think of the internal contradictions of any country that is standing up to U.S. imperialism. And that should be our unifying principle. And it's one that will bring us into much greater alignment, I would say, with those billions and billions who are actively resisting the U.S. empire, within the global majority, whose perspectives are, so often systematically excluded from our discourse. So I just want to close on that reminder to our movements here in the Imperial Court.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who joined. Thank you, panelists, for your incredible contributions, particularly in this moment when it's hard to decipher what is like true and what is false. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think you can follow us on No Cold War in Twitter, Instagram, and various other platforms. But importantly, I think we need to continue to create these kind of spaces where we can have these kind of discussions, because it's not happening. It really is not happening. And I'm so grateful for all of you panelists who joined us today, because in this moment when we are on the brink of nuclear disasters, climate catastrophes, it's super important to have everyone who are interested in change, who are interested in stability, who are interested in countering the narrative, and who are interested in shifting the geography of reason, as it's called. So thank you very much, everyone who has joined us. Thank you to all our panelists. Again, we will be pushing and struggling for a more peaceful world and a better world, because honestly, we deserve it. Everyone deserves much better than what we're given right now. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.